Thank you. Thank you, Sandra.
Okay, I want to welcome everybody to Dallas, What Really Happened. And John Powers is going to enlighten us. So John has taught for several universities and colleges and their lifelong learning programs since 2013. By profession, he currently is a director of narrative and documentary films. He began his career as a screenwriter. Later, he turned to performing arts as a producer and presenter of live cultural events. Recently, he returned to filmmaking. He has published several fiction and nonfiction books. He is a graduate of the University of Southern California with an MFA and a BFA in drama. He also is going to be teaching a class for us in the spring called, I think,
Nixon's resignation reconsidered.
Yeah, exactly. So hopefully y'all will enjoy this class and we'll come back for him in the spring as well. So I'm going to turn it over now to John. I will be working in the background, so I'm going to have my microphone off and my video, but I am still here. I'll still be able to listen. And I do want to stress that if you are not speaking and you have a lot of background noise going on at your house, to please mute your device. So you can ask questions. Just remember that you may be on mute when you do so. So go ahead, John.
Sandra, thank you very much. And I am honored to be part of the University of Arkansas OLLI community. It's the second course that I've been able to offer for this community, and I am so pleased to be with you once again.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
John, Sandra, we still have on the screen that you've got it being recorded. We can't see your face.
It's okay. I'm going to share the screen in a moment. Right now, it's just faces talking. Can you see me?
No.
You just, what do you see, black?
No,
there's a big sign in front of your face saying that it's being recorded.
Oh, she's got
Oh, okay. All right. Well, you guys are good. You know, the squeaky wheel gets fixed, right?
Yay.
Beautiful, baby. Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, you know, this is the first time that I've been able to offer a class in which several of you are in a shared room. So during the course of this, you'll have a lot to talk about, even when you are finished. Can you believe what he said? I have to tell you, you'll be able to have those kind of conversations. That's a wonderful thing. I will add just a little bit to what Sandra said about me. Indeed, my background is in drama, which I know it consternated my parents when I was a young man. But as I said, drama is an excellent field of study. It's one of the oldest forms of areas of study in academia, because it helps us to understand what's really going on. You know, so many people look at events and it's like what's happening in front of the curtain. But when you're in drama, you're very knowledgeable of what's happening behind the curtain. And when I was responsible for a theater series, I explored and I needed to create content. I turned to recent American history for that material. And when I transitioned into being an instructor, a teacher for a lifelong learning program, I brought a lot of that material, adapted it for a classroom experience. That's what has drawn me into recent American history. And I'm very pleased that you have an interest in not only this specific subject, but that general area of interest, because there's so much about our nation that is an official story, but what we're going to discover is what's really behind that story. So with that, I'm going to come down here and begin to share my screen. Also, if you have questions, even though Sandra's in the background, she won't be monitoring things. You can put things in the chat, but if you have a question, just don't hesitate to voice it, and I'll address it as we go along. I'm very capable of stopping what I'm doing, answering your question, and getting back into it. So don't hesitate. And here we go. And can everyone see what I am showing right now, where it says the title card, Dallas?
No.
No,
You cannot see that. So what do it says here? It says your screen sharing is paused. I wonder what that's about. Let me stop the share and I'll try it again. And we're in episode 3 here, episode 1, and we start the share.
There.
There
There
we
it
go. And see, that's the wonderful thing. In theater, if first you don't succeed, try it again. So the official title that I've given this class is Dallas, JFK's Assassination Through a Glass Darkly. And I will explain that in a few moments. But each of our class meetings, and we'll have 6 of them, I refer to them as episodes. You know, again, this is touching on my background in entertainment. And episode 1, I refer to as first responders, and that will become clear in a moment. So let me just introduce this course and take a look at this beautiful photograph here. This is the last sweet image that we will ever see of the president and, of course, the first lady there. In the jump seat is Governor John Connolly and his lovely wife, Nellie, who incidentally is also wearing a pink outfit to complement the first lady. And these 2 gentlemen in the front. Closest to us is Roy Kellerman, Secret Service, and the driver of the vehicle is Secret Service William Greer. More about these gentlemen as we go along. So here's where we begin. Now, I've chosen this phrase, through a glass darkly, from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, to express what I feel where we stand as a nation 60 years past the assassination of President Kennedy. In just a few weeks will be the 60th anniversary. And we can see and understand a great deal at this time. A lot has come forward. But I think at some point in the future, we will come face to face with the truth. There will be nothing between us and the truth. Right now, there's like a glass. It's a smudged glass, or as they said in King James, a glass darkly. And at that time, not only will we know, but we also will be known. We will be known as a nation, what kind of nation we really are. So, what's this all about? Take a look at this image that I have right here. This is from Dallas. Here's the presidential limousine going down Main Street, and look at how close people are toward the president and the first lady. They are many persons deep on the sidewalk. In fact, they're off the sidewalk in the street, reaching out, so much wanting to touch these 2 people. And nothing is happening to them at this close proximity. Okay. What's it all about? Well, let's start here. October 3rd, 1963, New York Times, one of their most noted journalists, Arthur Kroc, he wrote of a conversation that he had with an unnamed high-level White House authority. And he wrote in this article that you see to the right, the CIA's growth was likened to a malignancy, which the very high official was not sure even the White House could control any longer. if the United States ever experiences a coup to overthrow the government, it will come from the CIA and not the Pentagon. The agency represents a tremendous power and total unaccountability to anyone. This is the high-level but unnamed authority that Kroc was quoting, the president himself. Now, I'll give you a little background. Kroc was a very conservative writer for the New York Times, and he'd been with them for decades. He was a close associate, friend of the president's father, Joseph Kennedy, Joseph T. Kennedy. And when his son, John, determined he wanted to run for the presidency, Arthur Kroc went to Joe Kennedy and said, if your son needs anything, you let me know, and I'll make sure that it gets in the New York Times. And he did. Frequently, during his presidency, Kennedy would call up Arthur Kroc and be an unnamed source for the paper. Within 2 months of that article, the president would be dead. He'd be assassinated in a brazen operation in Dealey Plaza. And then on the day of JFK's murder in Dallas, the Attorney General called CIA Director John McCone and asked him, did your people do this? So the first of the first responders, as I've titled this episode, was Robert Kennedy. Now, we don't know whether he got an honest answer to his question. John McCone, he was a new director. He had no intelligence experience. He was replacing the fired Allen Dulles, and he had probably no idea of the malevolence that existed within his domain. Anyway, 1 month to the day of the president's open-air slaying, the Washington Post published this op-ed, Limit CIA Role to Intelligence. Here's a quote from it. I think it has become necessary to take another look at the purpose and operations of our Central Intelligence Agency. For some time, I have been disturbed by the way CIA has been diverted from its original assignment. It has become an operational and at times a policy-making arm of the government. And this has led to trouble and may have compounded our difficulties in several explosive areas. The writer of that op-ed was none other than former President Harry S. Truman, the executive whose actions brought the CIA into existence 15 years earlier. So people in the know knew a coup d'etat was coming, and people in the know knew when a coup d'etat had happened, and they spoke up. So a question that I ask, how dark was the glass in 1963 that they could see so clearly? Yeah. Well, here's where we're going. I'm going to lay my provocative thesis down. It is LBJ and CIA. The assassination and its cover-up were planned and carried out by CIA, albeit with support of the highest members of the military. The mastermind of the operation in Texas and its cover-up was Lyndon Baines Johnson, Vice President of the United States of America. This course will present direct evidence to support those statements. This course will provide you with a framework to understand what happened in Dallas 60 years ago. It'll provide you with a concise yet comprehensive understanding of the vast amount of information that has come to light during these decades. You know, I refer to as the Kennedy assassination as a 100,000 piece jigsaw puzzle. And that's just too much for anybody to deal with. So I'm going to sweep 99,000 pieces off the table onto the floor, just leaving 1,000 pieces for us to assemble and form a very clear picture of what happened. But there is irony even in this statement, because none of this information that has come to us is really necessary. And by that I mean the pursuit and exploration of this vast amount of information, which we've been, and many others have been carrying on for 60 years, is and has been a distraction from what had been blatantly evident from the beginning. The president, in the words of one early observer, was fired. He was fired by the actual forces of power in our nation. And his firing in such a brutal manner was a demonstration of their power. It was a message to all. We rule, and the rest of you are mere subjects. So here's where the story began on that day and at weekend. And it's a shaping of the story. And I think all of you will recognize this familiar face. This is the anchor for CBS News, Walter Cronkite. As a nation, our understanding, or perhaps our misunderstanding of what occurred in Dallas 60 years ago, was formed by the diverse reporting in print and electronic media. And when I say diverse, I mean it was all over the map. During the period of November 22nd through November 24th, there were reports that contradicted one another, wildly contradicted one another. An example of it is this is the first weapon that was found in the Texas School Book Depository. And this is not a Mannlicher Carcano with a badly sighted scope. This is a Mauser 7.65 with a precisely sighted scope. But that went away, as did the Enfield rifle that was found on the roof of Texas School Book Depository. The news media, especially prominent individuals in the electronic news media, voiced and repeatedly voiced information that was unsubstantiated. In essence, they were propagandists for a developing official story. And in a state of shock and seeking some coherence, the American people were tossed from one set of facts to another set of facts. And here is a group of people in New York City reading the newspaper, trying to comprehend what has happened, reading everything they can get their hands on, listening to everything they can, and just judging from the expression on their faces, they don't know what is going on. In large part, this is because the conspirators themselves were struggling to get their story straight in a kinetic environment. And there were competing stories. Was it a lone nut? Was it a Cuban plot? Was it a combination of the two? Was it something altogether different? Very soon, we would have the answer, provided, of course, by the actual rulers of our nation. And to many, that story still stands. Any history book, high school history book, and I dare say there's 50 different textbooks across the nation, they'll all tell the same story, and it's the one that was laid down that weekend. It is put into stone by this group of gentlemen right here, the Warren Commission. our official understanding of what occurred was first formed by the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, commonly known as the Warren Commission. Within days of JFK's public murder, LBJ called for a blue ribbon commission to explain to the American people what had happened in Dallas, especially in light of the on-camera murder of its sole suspect. Within days of JFK's death, Johnson, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and Acting Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, and the three gentlemen are shown in the image here, had agreed that a presidential commission should be established. Well, this was to circumvent proposed inquiries by Congress, and especially the state of Texas. The presidential commission would lend credence to the FBI's report and its foregone conclusion that Oswald was the assassin and the only assassin. That's the story that has to be sold. It was Hoover's original statement that became the mission statement for the Warren Commission. The thing I am concerned about, and so is Katzenbach, is having something issue so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin. Well, LBJ knew that in his partnership with Hoover, the ultimate power to control the outcome of the investigation and report would be theirs and theirs alone. He knew that the information to be fed to the commission would be tightly controlled through Hoover, and that they would develop a direct channel inside the commission through at least one member, Congressman Gerald Ford. He called up the FBI and said, hey, if you guys need to know anything that's going on the inside, I'll tell you. Really didn't need to know that since they already had Allen Dulles, former director of the CIA there, but Gerald Ford he'll prove his worth down the road here. The presentation of its findings to the public, including the frequent leaks, would be done by men whose credibility was apparently unassailable. LBJ knew that these men would ultimately fall into line because their careers depended upon it. Everyone on the team would be convinced that convicting Oswald on the president's schedule, that is before the November '64 election, was first and foremost the essential objective. Before the commission, the first order of business was in the selection of the general counsel who would report to its titular head, Earl Warren. And here we see Earl Warren standing in front of his day job, the Supreme Court. And as it's commonly known, figureheads of any commission, they do very little work. In fact, they very seldom show up to any of these meetings. The responsibility and power resides in the general counsel. But before I leave Earl Warren here, LBJ had to twist his arm because Warren said it isn't appropriate for the Supreme Court justice to be sitting on this right here. He told LBJ that twice no. But LBJ came to him and he said, you know, there's a lot of talk that this could have come from Cuba or Russia. And if that's the case, or even a hint of it, you know, the American people are wanting to get us into war with Cuba or the Soviet Union. And you know, that'll lead to at least 40 million American deaths. And Mr. Justice, do you want the blood of 40 million Americans on your hands? That's exactly what LBJ told this gentleman here. He brought Supreme Court Justice to tears in that meeting. And he relented. He said, I will do it. And once he left the meeting, guess what LBJ did? He had a good laugh. He called him, guess what? I brought old Earl Warren to tears. Anyway, rather than allow Chairman Warren to designate his own choice, Hoover and Katzenbach mounted an offensive campaign through Commissioners Gerald Ford and John McCloy. Now, McCloy just happened to have a short list of choices on hand, one of which was J. Lee Rankin, who was nominated, seconded, and voted unanimously as the commission's general counsel. So this is where all the work went down at, right there. From then on, with the assurance that everyone down the line in both the agencies and the commission, members were finally on board with the real agenda and mission, and that there were no mavericks around to spoil the process. The Johnson-Hoover objective to contain and direct the course of the investigation was complete. Testimony by many eyewitnesses, that is, bystanders who happened to have chosen the area, and by the area I mean Dealey Plaza, right on Elm Street, to watch the motorcade, their testimony would be changed to fit the pattern that was quickly established by the plotters. Now, I don't know if these two young women here are familiar to any of you in our room right now. The woman to the left is Jean Hill. The woman to the right is Mary Moorman. They had come to Dealey Plaza with a Polaroid camera because they wanted to take a photograph of Mary Moorman's boyfriend, who was one of the Dallas motorcycle officers. And she happened to catch one of the most memorable images from that day. It's this image here. You can see a thumbprint on the Polaroid image that came out of there, but there's a lot of information in this image that experts have drawn out. I won't go into it now. But the FBI excised all reports of gunshots and testimony that people were saying, hey, it came from the grassy knoll, because they were trying to prove conclusively the unstated mission of the commission, which is that it came from the Texas School Book Depository. They wanted to avoid a truthful accounting of events in favor of a preordained verdict. We'll come back to this later. Anyway, the commission's decision to publish the 912-page book, followed afterwards by 26 more volumes and 50,000 more pages of documents, was designed to show the public that the investigation appeared thorough and complete. But in truth, this was done to obfuscate the fact that they had explored only one very narrow lead, effectively excluding all others. And here we see in this photograph, the volume that's front and center right there, that is the executive summary. And in the background are the 26 more volumes. There we are. The presentation of the Warren Report to LBJ, and it was presented to him, not to Congress, not to the American people, because it was the president's commission. And it was done prior to the election, and it was celebrated by newspapers and news magazines throughout the US as the end of a long and arduous task conducted by a large staff of lawyers and their assistants who completed their charge in record time and whose work resolved the crime of the century. And look at this banner on the left-hand side of Time magazine right there, and that's the message they were trying to get across. No conspiracy, domestic or foreign. It's a lone nut who all by himself, with 3 shots from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Well, none of this was really new news, since Hoover had seen to it that the FBI reports had been leaked to the press months before, followed by periodic leaks of other materials, just to keep the nation's thirst for more knowledge quenched and to prepare it for a preordained verdict. At any rate, all of the commission's records were then transferred to the National Archive. The unpublished portions of those records was initially sealed for 75 years to the year 2039, under a general policy that applied to all federal investigations by executive branch of the government. You know, this was a period intended to serve as protection for the innocent, who could otherwise be damaged by the relationship with the participants in the case. There it went. With the release of the report, Gallup polling indicated that belief that Oswald acted alone was at an all-time high, 36%. I guess that means that 64% weren't quite so sure. Mainstream media, however, they responded quickly and positively, although it's unlikely that any of these organizations had actually read much of it. They came out with reviews. I think of the one in the New York Times the next day proclaiming the success of the commission report. However, as private citizens began to delve into and publish their criticisms of the report, not only did belief that Oswald was the lone gunman begin to wane, but so did the public's trust in their government. And I dare say that waning of the public trust in government began then, is very much with us today. Now, this begins the rebuttal. Before that, let me just drop down here to see what's in the chat, see if there's something I need to address there. Someone needs to put their computer on mute, please. For the moment, if you need to, just put your computer on mute. If you have a question, unmute and ask me the question. Thank you. Okay. So now a rebuttal to the Warren Commission begins. I don't know if any of you recognize this gentleman who I show in this image here. I won't keep you guessing. This is Jim Garrison, who was district attorney for New Orleans. The official report of the Warren Commission was subject to strong criticism and ridicule by a small number of researchers. Their incredulity led others, eventually many others, to discredit the veracity of its conclusions. One of the first people to respond was Fred Cook, a crime journalist for New York Herald Tribune, shown here in this image. Cook had established his national reputation with a very successful examination of Alger Hish. So he had the cred. But he was unconvinced that JFK was murdered by a lone gunman. He thought Oswald was involved. He just didn't think he was by himself. He had, however, difficulty finding a publisher for his work. No one wanted to touch it. And here he is, a very successful author in the publishing capital of the United States, and no one wants to look at his work. Another skeptic was Harold Weisberg, an investigator who had served the State Department. In '65, Weisberg, again, self-published, whitewashed, his critique of the commission when, again, no U.S. publisher would touch the subject. And he used the Warren Report to dismantle the Warren Report. All of these early responders, these first responders, all they had to work with was the Warren Commission report. But it was such a damaged document, there was so much in there for them to work with. And in Weisberg's case, he used the shortcomings of the commission report, its seemingly predisposed conclusions, and the suppression of key information to take it apart. Now, I will tell you, Weisberg has now passed on, but he is available to listen to on YouTube. He made many presentations, and he's such a wonderful, very deliberate critic of the Warren Commission and the whole pursuit for justice. So if you ever come across Harold Weisberg, he's someone in whom you can have confidence. I will say his self-published whitewash from 1965 was so successful that Dell Publishing said, hey, what the heck, let's do it. So they broke the barrier that the government clearly had put out there, and they picked up the license to publish Whitewash, and it became a major bestseller through Dell, but that was in '66. Here's another individual I'd like to draw your attention to. This is Sylvia Marr. That's how her name is pronounced, Marr. A research analyst at the UN's World Health Organization. She took a strong interest in the assassination. She read the executive summary and all 26 volumes of the hearings and exhibits, and she was appalled by the report's dishonesty, because what's in the 26 volumes don't support the executive summary at all. And she made this enormous contribution in 1965 when she published a subject index to the Warren Report and hearings and exhibits, because when this was published, it had no index. You could never find what you were reading again. You'd have to spend hours searching for it. She took on the yeoman's task of creating a subject index, and that became an invaluable tool for all future researchers. Although I will say, Sylvia then went on to write her own criticism of the report in a book titled Accessories After the Fact. Here's a gentleman I don't know that you've ever heard of. It's William Penn Jones, Jr. He was a journalist, World War II vet, well known for his research into the assassination of JFK. He wrote a series of books entitled Forgive My Grief, and he was an editor-in-chief of the Continuing Inquiry, which was a newsletter focused on assassinations, many assassinations. He's one of the first generation of researchers who felt the government was behind the assassination, probably a conspiracy involving military intelligence, and he always thought LBJ was behind it. William Penn Jones, quite a guy. Mark Lane is probably the best known among the early critics, the first responders here. He was a defense lawyer. He never doubted Oswald's innocence, and he offered to represent his interest before the commission. Of course, the commission did not take him up on that. In 1966, Lane published Rush to Judgment, which became a bestseller, and his exhaustive investigation provided a roadmap to the body of evidence about the assassination. Mark Lane was so successful, the CIA put on their thinking caps and they coined a new term that's still very much with us. It's called conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist. The CIA created that term in 1966 to disparage Mark Lane and the success that he was having with his work, Rush to Judgment. However, attention to the assassination climaxed in 1967 when Jim Garrison, New Orleans District Attorney, prosecuted businessman Clay Shaw, who was a CIA contract agent. But when that trial ended in a not guilty verdict, the subject of JFK's murder subsided for a number of years. And that's what we'll see. So they're like a whole focus on it in decades, and then it goes to sleep. And then it reawakens again, and then it goes to sleep, and then it reawakens again. Among the first things to bring about a reawakening is this Senate subcommittee here, known as the Church Committee. In 1975, after the aftermath of the Watergate scandal and resignation of President Richard Nixon, a series of Senate investigations into intelligence abuses began in Washington, D.C., and among these was the Church Committee that investigated abuses by CIA, NSA, FBI, and IRS. And the committee was led by Idaho Senator Frank Church. Among the many illegal activities that the committee exposed were operations known as MK Ultra. The MK is for mind control. This is the CIA's use of LSD to persuade people. COINTELPRO, which was a intelligence program focused on the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. And Family Jewels. Family Jewels was a CIA program to covertly assassinate foreign leaders. Now, the person we see before us here is Richard Helms. At the time of the assassination, he was director of plans for CIA, and eventually he would become the director of Central Intelligence. Among the leaders who were assassinated under Family Jewels were Patrice Lumumba, Congo, Rafael Trujillo of Dominican Republic, and Rene Schneider of Chile. But the foreign leader for whom the CIA aimed and missed was Fidel Castro. They tried hundreds of times to get him, never got close. However, in the midst of the Church Committee, this thing happens. A copy of the Zapruder film, which is the 8mm home movie shot by Abraham Zapruder, was shown on national television for the first time. And the film had been supplied by Robert Groden to Geraldo Rivera. This was Geraldo's ABC program at that time, Good Night America. And Robert Groden was someone who worked in the video industry, and he came across a bootleg copy, and he brought it to America's attention. When this film was shown on Good Night America, it had a powerful effect. Ordinary citizens had developed a consensus that JFK had now been shot from the front, since his upper body and his head are seen in that film to move violently backward and to the left. Everything before then, we'd been told, he was shot from behind, and we never got to see the Zapruder film until 12 years later. And here we see Geraldo Rivera on the right. In the center is the comedian Dick Gregory, who was an advocate for President Kennedy, and Robert Groden on the left. After each class, and including the one today, I will send to Sandra for her to forward to you what I refer to as show notes. Now, the show notes will have some information that I'd like you to consider, as well as links to some YouTube entities. And one of them, I will send you this link from this Good Night America program so you can view what America saw in 1975. Well, since Oswald was allegedly behind JFK in the Texas Schoolbook Depository, the average man in the street no longer believed what was written in the Warren Report. That program on Geraldo Rivera that night had a devastating effect. But the establishment, however, they kept falling back on the judgments of medical experts, which were based upon the autopsy report written by pathologists and the continual re-examination of the visual record of the autopsy, including photographs and an x-ray. You can see from the x-ray here, there's nothing, the back of the skull, it's solid except for a small, entry wound. The blowout is in the front. What we will discover is that this x-ray image is the only one that managed to survive destruction by the authorities, is actually a forgery. But I'm going to hold that information until episode 6. But that's what the authorities were saying. The Zapruder film may show that, but hey, look at the evidence here. All of that evidence, however, was a deceit, including this x-ray here. Nonetheless, the Church Committee spent some portion of its time carrying out an investigation into the JFK assassination, questioning witnesses, accessing documents. In the committee's report, it questioned the processes for obtaining information. They blamed federal agencies for failing in their duties and responsibilities. and concluding that the investigation into the assassination had been deficient. The Church Committee's final report was published in April 1976, and now President Gerald Ford, our only unelected president, and formerly of the Warren Commission, he urged the Senate to withhold the report from the public, largely because of this discussion of assassination. Fortunately, in that effort, he failed. Now take a look at this image here of Gerald Ford in the center. Did any of you recognize the gentleman who was on the left and the gentleman who was on the right? I won't keep you waiting. On the left is Donald Rumsfeld. Now, at this time, he was serving as Ford's chief of staff. And on the right is Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney was serving on the president's staff, but he will later be appointed to Secretary of Defense. Well, in a much later presidential administration under George W. Bush, these two gentlemen would exchange positions. Rumsfeld would become Secretary of Defense, and for all intents and purposes, Cheney would become Chief of Staff as co-president, as he liked to think of himself. I went too far here. Okay, that brings us to this business right here, and I'm going to go up. Let's take a little pause right here. I'm going to go back up into the gallery, bring all of you forward if I can here, and let's take 5 minutes. So if you need to go away and get something to drink, do so now and come back. I'm going to stay on hand, but I'll address any questions that you have from the material that I've covered so far, or any comments that you want to make. Anybody? Don't make me call on you, Margaret, up in Seattle, baby. What's going on in your mind?
I am remembering back to that time when it happened, where I was when I heard that the president had been assassinated, and all the confusion and horror of the people at the time, that basically the world was ending.
Right.
How could this happen? And I mean, it's 60 years later, and I can still tell you the feelings I had about it, and why whatever they told us, I thought was true, because we were so innocent before then that nobody could imagine that it might be a real conspiracy until much later on.
Right. Very good. Thank you, Mark. I mean, that's really important. I mean, I think that's where all of us were at. I was a child in grammar school, and it was, we were sitting around the television trying to figure what happened here. How do we move forward as a nation? We were hanging on every word, and what I will be showing you is that most of those words were lies, unfortunately.
But I think we were so naive,
right? As a nation,
as a country,
as a nation,
yeah. Nobody could conceive of it being a lie.
Right. And that's why the official story went over so successfully, even though they were struggling to get their arms around, that is, the conspirators were struggling to get their arms around the story. And they finally did several days later, and then it was put into concrete with the Warren Commission, why it worked so effectively and why it still lingers with us today. So thank you, Margaret. Rebecca, what about you?
Yes, I'm going to ask a question that you're probably going to cover at a later time, but what I'm sitting here wondering is why? What would they be accomplishing? What was their goal? Why would they want to get rid of JFK?
Well, Rebecca, thank you for raising that. The answer is actually, as long as my arm, and I'll go into that in episode 4.
Okay.
There's all kinds of people for all kinds of different reasons. I think there is the most compelling reason, and it's kind of a surprising one. but it is coming from what I've referred to as the actual powers that be. You know, the CIA has its issues, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest level of the military, they have their issues, which we'll discuss. But I think over and above them, the real rulers of our nation, the bankers, the owners, they had their reasons for wanting JFK. They wanted this executive fired. Now, they could have fired him in a much quieter way, but they made a point of making it into a public and bloody killing. And that was its own message. But we'll deal with that in an upcoming episode.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Craig, how about you? Got anything? Or how about there in the room at University of Arkansas? Way in the back there. Jim and Lori. Or I should say Jim and Barbara.
That are here. I'm just wondering if I can shrink the images of all the other people there because we can't ever see the whole photographs. Or make them disappear. I know how to make them go away.
If it was on the left-hand side, it would really help.
Actually, you
Instead
can
of the
probably
right-hand
drag it
side.
over to the left.
How about that?
That did it.
Oh,
we-
boy, look at that. Look at that. Yeah, we have a Zoom master in the room. Any of you over there at the University of Arkansas, any thoughts that you have?
Yes. I'm wondering if JFK was aware of all these forces out there and had an idea of their plotting.
Yes, he did. And that's why, you know, I used that quote from, or that piece from Arthur Kroc, you know, 2 months back from early October of '63. JFK knew a coup d'etat was coming. And he knew they were after him. And unfortunately, he put himself out there a little too much. They were not going to let him get out of the month of November alive. But we'll get into that a little more deeper here as we go down here, Lori. But thanks for raising that. You know, one of the things that a very popular book at that time, and you may have read it, later made into a motion picture, was 7 Days in May. And JFK read it. He was fascinated with it. He was a friend of the author, and he gave the, when it was optioned for a movie, he gave John Frankenheimer, the director, the opportunity, hey, come in and you can film in the Oval Office. So all those scenes in 7 Days in May were filmed right in the Oval Office. And JFK had been asked, do you think we could have a 7 Days in May here? And he said, yes, we can. You know, if we have another event like the Bay of Pigs fiasco or something like that, you know, the military very well may step in and say, hey, I'm not the right guy. We'll deal with Bay of Pigs in an upcoming episode, though, to talk specifically about that. But so it was very much on his mind. All right. Unless anything else, let's head on down the river here, as I like to say. So the next investigation into this material begins with the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And what I'm trying to do, again, is just frame for you when events happened and when information came into the public realm. So we had the weekend news release, we had the Warren Commission, Church Commission to some extent, and now here comes a big one. I'll get this yet. Let me close this up here a little bit, and I'll come down here. The creation of the HSCA, which are its initials obviously, was owing to the efforts of Mark Lane. He carried a petition through the Capitol seeking the signatures of 100 congressmen, and he more than met that goal and received support from both liberal and conservative members. Back, I think I skipped one. Yep. As one Southern conservative said to him, nothing is settled until it is properly settled. So clearly, this Southern conservative did not think that the investigation into the president's assassination had been properly settled. The HSCA was created to examine both the Kennedy assassination and Martin Luther King Jr. assassination, because members of Congress had grown to suspect CIA and FBI had withheld information from earlier investigation into both of these murders. From the outset, however, there was criticism. Some members of Congress strongly objected to the naming of this gentleman shown to the right here, Richard Sprague, as chief counsel. As I've mentioned earlier on, it's the chief counsel of these agencies or these commissions that really set the agenda. And Sprague was reputedly honest and a tenacious investigator. And that's not what some members in Congress wanted. But with a requested budget of $6.5 million, a staff of 170 lawyers, investigators, and researchers, Sprague looked like he meant business. And that's not what Congress really wants. The original chairman, who was Sprague's champion, he stepped down from the committee. That left Sprague vulnerable. And the replacement chairman, he wanted to get rid of Sprague. Instead, the replacement chairman overplayed his hand and he was forced to step down. And a third chairman was named, and that's this gentleman see here to the left, Congressman Lewis Stokes from Michigan. But as things would have it, under this third chairman, Chairman Stokes, Sprague was pressured to resign. And he was replaced by G. Robert Blakey. And that's the gentleman that we see in the center of this photograph. And everything went downhill from there. Started with high ambitions and a great team, and it quickly dissolved into nothing. As a result, the committee achieved very little. In fact, the enterprise came crashing down when one of its investigators caught this major CIA officer, David Atlee Phillips, and we'll discuss David Atlee Phillips later. They caught him in a big fat lie. And David Atlee Phillips showed them who was really boss, because he walked out of that confrontation, and the next day, the committee's funding was withdrawn. They had their franking privileges revoked, they had their long-distance phone call, and the salaries of all the staff members were frozen. Now that's power. At any rate, the HSCA, found a compromise. They limped along. They never brought David Atlee Phillips back in to face contempt of Congress or his perjury charges. But they managed to get out their report in 1978. And it concluded that JFK was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. But the committee, in its weak-kneed manner, was unable to identify who this other gunman or the extent of the conspiracy. The HSCA found that although the Warren Commission and different agencies and departments examining JFK's assassination performed in good faith and were thorough in their investigation of Oswald, they performed with varying degrees of competency, and the search for a probable conspiracy was inadequate. How's that for weasel words, huh? That sounds like a commission. That sounds like Congress, doesn't it? The HSCA determined that the probable conspiracy did not involve the governments of Cuba or the Soviet Union. The committee also stated that the probable conspiracy did not involve any organized crime group or anti-Castro group. nor the FBI, CIA, or Secret Service. They don't have any idea who it is. One positive note about the HSC was the work of this investigator here. Many of the good investigators jumped ship. They got out the moment they saw the writing on the wall. They knew this was just a put-up job. But one person who stuck around was Gayton Fonzie. And he would go on to write and publish this work here titled The Last Investigation. He published it in 1993, and it details his pursuit for evidence. What Fonzie did not know at the time was that there would be yet one other investigation. So he was a little early with his titling of his book here. Another book that came out at that time that provoked a lot of discussion, I don't know if any of you had ever come across this work. It's called Best Evidence by David S. Lifton, and this was published in 1981. Lifton documented that there was strong evidence in the official record that the president's head wound, as seen at autopsy, had been expanded to 4 to 5 times its original size compared to what was seen during treatment at the Parkland Hospital. Now, what's that about? Well, we'll get deep into this subject in episode 6. But here is David Lifton, who was a doctoral student at UCLA, and he came across this story and he did not let go. He further documented strong circumstantial evidence that the chain of custody of the president's body during its transport from Dallas to Washington, D.C. was broken. Again, we will get deep into this in episode 6. These facts led Lifton to the conclusion that what should have been the best evidence in the assassination, that is the body of the slain chief of staff, had been tampered with prior to the autopsy in order to change the wounds and thus alter the nation's perceptions of what had happened in Dallas. And again, we will deal with this in detail in episode 6. There was a pre-autopsy before the official autopsy. And here is one of the few extant photographs from that pre-autopsy there. And you can see just how large this head wound that they created in the president's noggin there, and this gash, I'll use my cursor here just above the president's right eye, this deep gash that they cut open looking for bullet fragments in there. We'll explore this further in episode 6. In time, however, the controversy provoked by Lifton's work subsided, and the focus on JFK's assassination once again fell into the shadows. So we had this attention on it in the 60s, and at the close of that decade, everybody fell into slumber. But in the mid-70s, it all woke up again. But within 1981, again, we fell into a slumber. And then this thing came along. JFK, the movie. Now, I don't know how many, or if any of you have seen this movie by Oliver Stone. And here we see an image of the actors Donald Sutherland playing Mr. X and Kevin Costner playing Jim Garrison. Well, in late 1988, in late 80s and 1988, with the Clay Show now 20 years behind him, Jim Garrison wrote and published his account indicting the businessman for conspiracy to kill JFK. And his work, On the Trail of the Assassin, became a bestseller. Now, in that 1967 trial, Garrison charged that the elements of the United States government, in particular CIA, were behind the crime. On the Trail of the Assassin became the primary source material along with this other work that I'd like to call to your attention here, Jim Marrs' Crossfire, for director screenwriter Oliver Stone in his 1991 movie JFK, featuring Kevin Costner. Stone described this account as a counter myth to the Warren Commission's fictional myth. And many US newspapers and magazines ran editorials and reviews accusing the director of taking liberties with historical fact. Newspapers and magazines across the country who never saw the movie had these really very negative reviews, both about the material and Oliver Stone. But as Los Angeles Times, which was also very critical, they were, notice this headline, you know, suppression of the facts grants Stone a broad brush. So if you're going to keep things from the American people, who's to say these things aren't real? Well, despite the controversy, JFK received critical praise. It became the 6th highest grossing film of 1991, nominated for 8 Academy Awards, and it won 2, Best Cinematography and Best Editing. And I have to tell you, if you get these 2 awards, you really have the best movie of the year, because it's these 2 areas, cinematography and editing, that make the movie. But here's the clincher. At the close of the movie, there was a didactic panel that informs the audience that official records regarding JFK's assassination were sealed from the public until 2039, roughly 40 more years. And when people were in the theater, saw this, they came unglued. It set off a firestorm among viewers and the American electorate. It was a whole new generation of people who were coming to this subject matter. They didn't live through it, but they were offended that their government was holding information back from them. You say that we have the killer here, and it's one guy. Why are you holding this information back from us? So they contacted their elected representatives and they asked, why are these records not available now? And that question began a process in DC that led to the passage of, and this is its official name, President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. And this is what comes out of that act, the Assassination Records Review Board. Here's another image, obviously color image from that day in Dallas. And here's the presidential limousine coming down Main Street. And again, I call your attention, look at the depth of bystanders who want to reach out and touch the president there and be seen, be recognized by him. It's just an amazing image. The JFK Act, as it is commonly known, established this independent agency, the ARRB. And the JFK Act also required the government agencies to search for the records in their possession concerning the assassination and place them immediately in the National Archives. Now, here's an image of what we'll be looking at over the coming weeks, but I thought to put this large aerial view over here. I'm sure this is familiar to you, but I'll just draw your attention to something. You can see, in the center here, I'm drawing my cursor. This is Main Street right through here. On this horizontal is Houston Street. And then far over here on this curving street is Elm Street. And this large construction here, this is the triple overpass for rail traffic up in here. This is all rail traffic going across here. This building here, where you see the Hertz Rent-A-Car sign on the far left, that's Texas School Book Depository. Directly behind it, we'll have other images of it. This is the Dal Tex building, as in Dallas, Texas. This is the county records building right here, and this is the county courthouse right here. This area down below here is what is known as the grassy knoll, and there's a comparable grassy knoll over here. But we'll be talking about this area a great deal during the next 6 weeks. The ARRB consisted of 5 citizens trained in history, archives, and law who were not government employees, but who had the ability to order agencies to declassify government documents. And this is significant because it's the first time in history that an outside group had such power. These individuals approved by the president, and the president at this time was Bill Clinton. And the ARRB were assisted by a staff of 25 investigators. Now, once the ARRB made the decision that a document should be declassified, only the president could overrule its decision. The JFK Act specifically instructed the ARRB to go beyond the scope of the previous inquiries, since both the ARRB and its staff had high-level security clearances. No agency could prevent a search through every file. And then after locating files designated by the agencies, the ARRB staff members pursued new sources of assassination records. So they got into this tremendous process of revealing public documents that had not been done before. Most of the ARRB's additional requests for records went to CIA and FBI, but there were also requests to the Secret Service, Department of State and Defense, NSA, and the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Given the massive amount of volume of federal records, the search for additional records was time-consuming, often frustrating, because for every assassination record located and included in the collection, the staff literally reviewed hundreds of documents within it. And those documents located through the search for additional records are among the most important in the collection. Many were never reviewed by any of the prior investigations. Now, I've included something here that doesn't directly relate to what I've just said, but I thought you'd be interested in looking at it. This little graphic says, remember where you were at the time of, it kind of taps on to what Margaret was talking about there. So it obviously was done in the mid-2000s because it references Osama bin Laden's killing in 2011. So 9/11 attacks, JFK's assassination is still very much up there. 90%, 95% of the people who were older at the time, First Man on the Moon, Challenger, MLK, and the like. So it's still very much, at the time of this poll, still very much by the Pew Research Center, I might add, still very much on people's minds. More than 2 million documents were added to the National Archives through this process for a combined total of 5 million documents. Now, researchers have had access to this trove of documents since 1998, when the ARRB submitted its final report. And much of the information provided in this course derives from this recent research with those documents. And that's really what's significant. Now, not everything has been released despite the law demanding it. There's approximately 15,000 pages withheld by both President Trump and President Biden. But presumably these pages deal with Mexico's complicity with the CIA. You'll remember, you know, the JFK Act requires that all documents be released by 2017. And President Trump said, I'm going to do it. But then on the day of the event, he said, I was visited by 2 CIA people. And if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't release them either. So he kicked the can down to the next president, Biden. And Biden used the excuse of, well, the nation is going through a plague, you know, the COVID-19. This isn't the time to release information. So he withheld releasing it at that time. But when the plague eased up, Biden not only did not release any of those 15,000 pages, but on July 1st of this year, by executive order, he ended any action by the JFK Act. He said the government no longer needs to comply with this act. Now, he's been sued by several groups in the nation, but the result of that lawsuits have not come to the fore. But that just shows you, you know, it doesn't matter who's president. If they don't want to show you something, if they don't want to show us something, they're not going to do it. But there it is. Nonetheless, we have a good idea of what happened. And by that, I mean from the whole event of JFK's assassination and the cover-up, and more importantly, why it happened. And in this course, we will explore some of this information. As I said at the beginning, 1,000 pieces of this 100,000 piece jigsaw puzzle. And as I noted at the opening, we will see it, but we'll see it as through a glass darkly. So there we are for today. So let me come out of my screen share here and get into conversation with you. Now, one thing I'm going to suspect, I don't think you have the syllabus for this course, but I'm going to include it in the show notes for today that Sandra will pass on to each of you. So you'll be able to see what we're going to be covering. It also lists the sources that I've drawn from for this course. I don't put too many out there. I've just put the 3 leading ones. So you'll see that, and we can talk about that next week. I just want to get that forward. But of the things that I've raised so far, what's on your mind about that? Anything? Rebecca, let me go to you. Let me call on you, baby. You have to unmute. Unmute, baby.
Thank
Unmute.
you.
There you go.
I keep going back to why? Why would they be doing this? And you're going to answer that before we're finished with or at least you're going to give us some possible reasons why they would.
The list is long. The list is long.
Yeah. So does that mean that our leaders continue to be in that kind of danger from their own agencies?
Well, I'll give you a little hint here. One thing is, and there's a book, you know, because I teach another course that deals with JFK's administration, particularly vis-a-vis his developing policy in Vietnam. And the leading work in that is, it's called JFK and the Unspeakable. It's a powerful work. If any of you pick it up, it's a marvelous book. But in there, the author of that book makes the case JFK was killed because he was trying to end the Cold War, whereas the military wanted to win the Cold War. And that was a death sentence.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. I don't like it, but I can certainly understand it.
We'll get into that. We'll get into this more deeply.
Okay.
Margaret, how about you, baby?
Okay. Do you think that in today's world with the internet and all the 24-hour news cycles we have on TV, that the same thing could possibly happen again, or do you think that it's impossible to happen again?
Well, it'd be more difficult because, first of all, well, here's one thing that happened. What's the world that we live in? Every one of us, I'll find mine. Every one of us has one of these magic lanterns in our purse or pocket, okay? And at the one stroke, one rub of the genie lamp, out comes the genie, and we can ask anything of this genie we want, including take a picture. Cameras, still motion and motion cameras are everywhere. Now, so we record everything in our lives, what we eat, what our kids look like. Now, in Dealey Plaza, and we will deal with this in episode 5, many people there, just like Mary Mormon, were there with a camera because this was a big event in their life. In her case, she wanted to catch a photograph of her boyfriend, and she happened to catch the photograph of the president as the bullet struck him in the head.
Mhm.
Abraham Zapruder, now he's a dressmaker in Dallas. He bought that 8mm camera for this purpose of capturing the president. And he tried it out a few times at home. So that on the film is mostly home movie stuff. And the day of the event, he came to work and he did not bring his camera. But his assistant said, "You bought that camera to film it. Go home and get it." So he went home, got the camera, and then they showed up in Dealey Plaza. Now, he suffered from vertigo, and he was looking for a good place to shoot from, but he couldn't shoot over the heads of so many crowds. And she said, "I'll help you up." So along with his assistant, they climbed up onto that platform there around the colonnade, and with his assistant holding him steady, he captured the whole motorcade as it went across. And there were other people with cameras in Dealey Plaza, but all of these people were approached by people bearing identification as Secret Service. Now, these were not Secret Service people. They were conspirators walking around with false identification that had been created for them by the Technical Services Division of CIA. And they forcibly collected all those cameras. But when they got to Abraham Zapruder, they ran into a tough nut. This was a New York-born dressmaker. And when they tried to take his camera, he refused. He held onto that camera. And that is the only reason that we have the Zapruder film even in public awareness today. Now, I have more to say about that film down the road here, but so partly I'm trying to answer your question. We live in a world in which there's cameras everywhere, but there were many cameras there that day, and they were all confiscated. In fact, FBI went to every film development service bureau in the Dallas and Dallas area, and they confiscated every piece of developed film that had anything to do with Dealey Plaza over a 2-week period. They weren't going to let anything come into the realm.
Really?
Now, of course, they said to people, and people let, if the FBI needs it for their investigation, I'll let it go. That's how we were. What's the term you used earlier, Margaret? We were innocent. We believed in our government. They're trying to solve a crime. They weren't solving a crime. They were covering up a crime. And they were trying to remove every piece of evidence that the public themselves had collected on that day. I haven't answered your question. I realize that, but I've given you a lot of other things to consider.
No, I think you actually have answered it, because the answer is probably no, because today we are no longer innocent and everybody would not give up their cameras. It would be impossible, and you don't have to go anyplace. It's immediately in the cloud somewhere where, everybody can see it.
Right. We do it different. They do it differently.
Right.
On
Right.
the other hand, that I think we are so attuned to social media that if this were to happen again, and maybe it's happening now, we don't know it, because I think they can manipulate the social media in a way that we can still be fooled.
Yeah,
Right,
nobody.
right.
Yeah, right. There is no truth that we really know anymore.
We always have to question.
That's true.
Even if we had a camera, that could be, we know this, even on YouTube, they modify camera.
One thing I will get into is about photo manipulation. there is a tremendous amount of photo manipulation in this story. And when it comes up, I will address it at that time. I don't want to get ahead of the story right here. But so we had that ability back in early 60s, and those technologies are way ahead of where we're at today. And now they're in the hands of everybody, but that's still very present. We can create any illusion we want, and so can they.
What I just can't understand, and maybe you'll get into this, is who says, I mean, who is behind the curtain? I mean.
LBJ is behind the curtain.
In that instance, by himself, I mean, or did he have, the CIA was in his ear, or he was in their ear?
I'll get into that more specifically in episode 4 when I talk about the conspirators, because I want to give you a better understanding of just who LBJ is. And I'll do that next episode when we kind of do a survey of his biography to help us understand who is this man and how he works. And then it'll help understand how he drew conspirators toward him, if that's okay. Yeah. Anybody else out there that wants to raise some things here that are on your mind? Don't hesitate at all. I want you to feel comfortable in this room with you. We are a small community. Everything is safe here. And questions that you may have, please feel free to voice them.
Well, I just think that by them denying us access, I think they're sort of shooting themselves in the foot. That creates much more interest than if they just let us see what happens. Right. I mean, by like Biden ending all action and all that, well, that makes me incredibly curious. Like, well, what exactly is in that paper? And I think by hiding it all, it makes everybody. It just keeps the interest out there.
Well, I'll tell you. Here's what I don't know what's in those 15,000 or so documents, but here's what I think is in there based upon what I've gathered from other researchers. It has to do with Mexico City. Now, one of the things, and we'll get into this later on, the CIA was trying to create a false story that Oswald was in Mexico City in September, October of 1963, particularly September. And what he was doing, he was going to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City and loudly saying, I want a visa to go to Cuba because I'm going to kill the president and I want a place to hide out. Now, Oswald, and this is a story that the CIA has created and is promoting right through the assassination, days afterwards, because they're looking for a cause for the US to invade Cuba and have regime change there. They're still smarting over their fiasco of Bay of Pigs. But Oswald was never in Mexico City at that time. There was an imposter that the CIA had posed to do these actions, and that person had been photographed entering and leaving. And in fact, we had bugged the Cuban embassy. So we were recording this conversation as it went on, and we were going to use it as evidence against him. But when the Patsy Oswald, who I will refer to occasionally to as Harvey Oswald, was captured and his image and his voice was on the news, it didn't jibe at all with this imposter. And J. Edgar Hoover himself, as he was saying, we can't use this information at all because it's not believable anymore. So they threw that whole thing out the window, but the CIA kept trying to push it and the like. So what happened was, before that was revealed, the CIA, there was a woman, a Mexican national, her name was Sylvia Duran. She worked the desk in the Cuban embassy. That she's the person that Oswald confronted. And the CIA tried to get her to say that she was Oswald's girlfriend, and that indeed this was Oswald who was in there, and she refused to do it. So the CIA turned to their Mexican counterpart, that is the Mexican version of the CIA, to arrest her and torture her until she made that admission. And she refused to do it. And they held her for months, and they tortured her and held her in isolation until finally they released her. That's what I think is in those documents, because it is so embarrassing to Mexico's sovereignty and what it tells us about both the CIA and Mexico's version of the CIA. But that's all supposition there. Okay.
Yes.
Anybody else? Indeed, that's why they don't want that information out there. It'll make everybody look bad.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that, I've always kind of believed it was all of the above, you know.
Yeah.
Because he was supposed to invade Cuba, and they put a lot of money into his election, and then he backed out. And you don't do that to the mafia. And then Oswald was associating with this guy down in Florida who was connected to the mafia and the CIA. When you get to a certain level, it's kind of all the same stuff, you know, that the same people that you're dealing with.
Yeah, I'm going to reveal, again, it sounds like everything is going to happen in episode 4, but I'm going to reveal some of these kinds of connections that you're just touching upon right now in episode 4. But I don't want to get ahead of myself, because I laid a lot of information on you today. I'd like for you to digest it, and just it takes time, and that's why I'm glad that we have the opportunity of having 6 weeks, in 12 hours to go through this kind of material, because it takes this amount of time to comprehend it and digest it, and then have questions come up naturally that don't that aren't settling with you, that you can raise at any time with me in this. Okay. All right. Anybody else?
It's very disheartening that the government was so busy lying to us and covering up all those years ago. And I don't think it's any better.
Yes, there's still light to us.
My work here is done. Our government was founded on the basis of suspicion. We must always suspect our leaders. This is 1789. Do not trust people in authority. We just got through throwing over a royal government that we didn't trust in. We did not want to have another version of that come into place. So the foundation of our constitutional republic is suspicion. We must always suspect people in authority, because they're always going to lie to us. And boy, this story, you're going to see it upside one side and down the other.
They did it all during Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah. Indeed.
It gives a whole new meaning to drain the swamp.
Yeah, Barbara.
You mentioned 2 of the rifles that were supposed to be found in a school book dispository. Do you think Oswald, who was barely able to shoot a rifle in his time in the Marine Corps, could actually pull off a shot, 3 shots from a World War I bolt-action rifle with just regular ammunition, was not, hand loaded and moving it with a vehicle moving at 30 miles per hour?
I personally shot that rifle. You could buy them for $20 back in the 50s.
Right.
And I'm telling you, he could not have done that with that rifle.
Yeah.
It had a cheap scope on it, and it's a terrible caliber. And I shot it. I see he could not have done it with that rifle.
Right.
He could not have done that.
Yeah, it's the stupidest thing in the world for them ever to have injected that weapon into the store, because it raised so many questions. Oswald, and I'm here. Here's a spoiler. This also will go to episode 4. There are two, I've kind of talked about, there are two Lee Harvey Oswalds. And I'm going to distinguish them in your mind by calling one a Lee Oswald and a Harvey Oswald. And this is based upon the research of a gentleman named John Armstrong. He is listed on your source list, but he's done tremendous work in identifying that Lee Harvey Oswald project is an early 1950 CIA project to introduce a defector into the Soviet Union. However, both of those Oswalds, the Lee Oswald and the Harvey Oswald, were both in the Texas School Book Depository on November 22nd. Lee Oswald knew of Harvey's presence there, but Harvey, who's being set up as the patsy, did not know that Lee was there. But neither Lee nor Harvey fired any weapon that day. The palm print that is found on the stock of that Mannlicher Carcano was taken to the mortuary by Dallas police, and they pressed Oswald's dead palm on the rifle stock. That's how they got the palm print. He never fired any weapon, much less the Mannlicher Carcano that day.
And he got 3 shots off in 3 seconds, and you're just not.
Yeah, but that was the story. That was the official story that they gave. We got one guy from behind, 3 shots, make it work. And that's what those guys on the Warren Commission were left working with. And so anything that contrary to that, they never looked at. They didn't want to look at it. They had a charge from Johnson, and they were going to deliver him a birthday present.
Who convinced the Dallas police to go and get that palm print on that weapon?
They're all following their chief, Curry. All of these orders are coming down from LBJ through his henchmen. LBJ, and that's why I'll take time next week talking about LBJ's behavior to understand how he works. LBJ only deals with a few people at his level, but it's those people who pass on LBJ's orders. LBJ will work closely with J. Edgar Hoover and with James Rowley, head of Secret Service, and James Rowley is the one who is giving orders to Sheriff Bill Decker, Dallas Sheriff's Department, and Chief Jesse Curry of Dallas Police. So that's how the food chain will descend, and we'll see how things come from there. And then, Dallas Police, I feel like I'm going on and on here a little bit. So Dallas Police were one of the dirtiest police departments in the nation. It was widely known. They had a group of officers that were fixers. If they needed to have a guy made to look guilty, these cats would go out there and just frame up, fix the evidence to make this person seem to be the guilty party. They were expert in this. So taking the stock of the Mannlicher Carcano to the mortuary was old business for guys on the police department.
The other thing that I question, and I don't know, the times were different then, is Jacqueline Kennedy was there. She had seen where the bullets came into JFK's head. And either she was told to shut up, she didn't have the space to say anything. It's just an interesting dynamic that I don't think would hold today with the change in, hopefully, the environment.
I will say this, Jacqueline Kennedy said repeatedly on that day, particularly in reference to her outfit, when, again, I'm getting this is from episode 6, but I'll give it to you now, because they asked her, Johnson and Lady Bird came to her and said, wouldn't you like to change out of that mess and put on this night white dress here? And her answer is, no, I want them to see what they have done to my husband. So she was very clear about that. And that's one of the few things that made its way into William Manchester's book. But then she became much more discreet as time went on. And I dare say some of that was in consultation with her brother-in-law, Robert Kennedy. They knew what they were up against with LBJ. Since they were out of power, they had nothing. You know, RFK, you know, his access to power died with his brother in Parkland Hospital.
Yeah, and then they killed him.
And then they killed him. Yeah, we'll talk about that along the way here.
What about Jack Ruby? What was, you know, obviously he was dying, but there had to be something that he would have gotten out of killing Oswald.
Jack Ruby is a very interesting character. He's one of those 99,000 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle I've swept off the table here. But I will answer a little bit about Jack Ruby in Q&A that is like this. Jack Ruby is a fascinating character. Some people think he's a little psychopathic. I don't. Jack Ruby had a long history with organized crime, but also working with the government. He was an informant to the young Congressman Richard Nixon in the 40s. Jack Ruby left Chicago and he came down to Dallas and he set himself up as a club owner. He ran a very popular strip club known as the Carousel, and this strip club was very popular with the Dallas Police Department. He had a standing order never to charge a policeman for a drink in the Carousel. So you better believe Dallas police used to hang out a lot at the Carousel Club. Jack Ruby, as a consequence, had complete access to the Dallas Police Department headquarters. And on the weekend of, particularly Friday night, all day Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, he was running around in the Dallas Police Department, bringing in coffee and sandwiches. Of course, he had a .38 revolver in his pocket because he had a mission. His mission, he was given to kill the patsy. And I feel like I'm giving way too much information here. It's ahead of ourselves. But Oswald was intended to be killed long before he was never meant to be arrested. He was meant to be killed during his arrest. And now they had a problem. They had this guy who was outspoken. He was denying everything. He was calling for, you know, a representative, you know, attorney to represent him, which they denied him. He was calling for his intelligence handler who was back in North Carolina, and they wouldn't put his call through. They had to get somebody in there to kill him, and that was Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby was paid $50,000. It settled a outstanding IRS debt, and Jack Ruby put it in the safe with a note that, you know, after my arrest, you know, pay off this IRS debt here, which it was. Jack Ruby had complete access, as I said. He was let into the basement when they were going to transfer him from the city jail to the county jail. And that's when Jack Ruby stepped right out. I will say also about Jack Ruby did not want to, I'll use this term from the Bible, he did not want to bear this cup. He was calling anonymously into the police department saying, someone's going to kill Oswald. You've got to be more careful with him. You've got to transfer him now. And of course, they didn't pay any attention to it, but he repeatedly was calling with that message because he did not want to carry out this hit job. And in fact, one of the people who answered the call said, Jack Ruby, is that you? And then, of course, the phone hung up. But Ruby, you know, he had to, you know, he was given a deal that he couldn't refuse. So he's the one who fired the bullet into Oswald's, you know, abdomen.
And if you want a job done right, you hire the professionals, the ones that know how to do it.
Yep, there you go. And he was carrying a professional weapon, a .38 revolver that was poked right into the abdomen. That's a done deal. Well, everyone, you know, I think we're off to a good start here.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with me. and being together here. As I said, I will put together some show notes, which I'll send to Sandra for her to forward to you. Oh my God, look who's up there. Look who's up there with Margaret. He's on camera, baby. Camera bomb you. And you can review these things, and I look forward to being with you next week.
Thank you.
Well, Sandra, thank you very much for hosting us today, and we'll see
Yeah.
one another next Monday.
Thank you very much.
Guys,
Okay.
please remember that if you want to, you can come to the office and view it at the office, or you can do it at your home. John, of course, is coming to us from California, so of course he's going to be on it via Zoom. And John, if you would just send those handouts to the OLLI email, and as soon as we get them, we'll get them sent to the participants.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Sandra.
All right, and I will try to get the recording sent to y'all by Wednesday of this week for this week's session, so y'all can review it in time for next week.
Again, thank you very much. Appreciate that very much.
All right.